Now for more analysis on this case is Shapiro, a criminal law specialist. Lou, thanks so much for being here. Should this case come to trial, what defense could possibly be mounted to find defendants who took part in procuring these drugs for Perry not guilty?
Well, these are very difficult cases for the defense part. We have to, try to make arguments to try to defray any culpability. Oftentimes, the defense sounds something like, well, if I wouldn't have given him the drugs, somebody else would have. Or this addiction that Perry developed was on his own accord. It wasn't from the people that gave him the drugs. But as we all know, those types of arguments, they really don't go very far. Interestingly, in this case, Perry was getting the drugs from two different sources, doctors and separately from a drug dealer. And it appears that it was the drug dealers were the ones that were like the fatal dose for Perry. But the reason why the doctors were also prosecuted is because their involvement in supplying Perry with the ketamine led to this addiction that went beyond the normal addiction to the point where he just couldn't get enough of it and unfortunately had the fatal blow.
Let's talk about that because ketamine is a treatment that is being used for people. I know people who get ketamine treatments and they don't become addicted and they don't overdose on the drug. How do they separate, legally speaking, how do you separate what is to blame? So the doctor's giving someone ketamine and the outcome isn't overdose, isn't addiction. How do they separate that when it comes to a defense and a prosecution?
So basically, the prosecution looks at what is the reasonable and medical standard for the administration of this particular substance, in this case, ketamine. Yes, it is used in a therapeutic manner when appropriate, but if a prosecutor sees that, like in this case, that just, barrels, so to speak, of it were being supplied to Perry and his live-in assistant was being told how to give him the injections, that's just not the conventional way that ketamine is supposed to be used. It's supposed to be used under a monitored circumstance where it's being administered properly by certified and licensed healthcare professionals. That was not done here. This was just basically, complete chaos, so to speak. It called for a criminal prosecution.
I want to play a clip from the news conference that happened earlier today with the U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada announcing these charges in this case, and specifically where he talks about the defendants in this case. So let's take a listen.
These defendants took advantage of Mr. Perry's addiction issues to enrich themselves. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew what they were doing was risking great danger to Mr. Perry, but they did it anyways.
The way it's being talked about strikes me a little bit as odd, just because there's no such thing as an ethical drug dealer. How does personal responsibility then factor into all of this, if at all?
Well, look, yeah, it should and it does, and it's oftentimes argued by the defense at sentencing when asking for compassion for the defendant. The argument is something like, well, Judge, the defendant standing next to me wasn't the one that created Perry's addiction. Yes, it facilitated it and it helped him get through what he was going through, but it would have happened regardless of my client. And again, it's, those arguments, they just don't go very far. It seems that, someone who is addicted to drugs and overdoses on it, it's a tragedy. And oftentimes the people that pay for it are the people that supplied the person with those drugs. Whether they intended for the person to die or not, it's almost like you're doing something very reckless, very reasonably likely would lead to injury, and now you have to pay the price for it.
And on that same note, when it comes to Hollywood drug deaths, unfortunately, there have been many, but another famous comedian comes to mind, John Belushi. He died of a drug overdose in 1982, and a woman named Kathy Smith was convicted of second-degree murder and actually sentenced to 15 months in prison for giving Belushi those drugs that led to that overdose. How does this kind of precedence play into criminal prosecution of those culpable in Matthew Perry's death?
Well, first of all, I'm impressed that you knew about that case since you weren't even born yet in 1982.
Wow.
But moving past that, normally we see these types of cases in the fentanyl world. And I'm sure many people have seen the movie on Netflix that goes into the opioid addiction crisis that perforated this country over the last 20 years. We don't see it oftentimes in ketamine. So every time we see sort of a new drug being brought into the criminal sphere, like ketamine in this sense, tied into a prosecution resulting in a fatality, it is interesting. There is some precedence to it. And what it shows is that the government is going to prosecute anyone and everyone that contributes narcotics that lead to deaths in anybody, regardless of whether it's been prosecuted before or not. Everything's on the table in these cases.
You know, I mentioned that statistic not too long ago about the number of people in this country who die from drug-involved overdoses every single year. To my knowledge, their deaths, not all of them are investigated, certainly not like Perry's have been, right? What legal recourse do the families of those loved ones whose deaths aren't investigated have?
Yeah, sadly, they don't really have much legal recourse. There's a lot of people that are just left holding their hands, throwing their hands up in the air, having to visit their loved ones in the cemetery every year in the memorial, wondering how did this happen? How did maybe doctors or friends that you would think you can trust would put someone in such a situation like this? It is a real problem. I think if you speak to most people by this point in time, everyone will know somebody who's had some challenge and battle with addiction. And it's the law always catching up to the science. That's an example of this in this case. And hopefully with government intervention, we can get more help to those who need it and prevent tragedies like this in the future.
Yeah, certainly so. Criminal law specialist Shapiro, thanks so much.
Sure.
Now on the